Hello everyone. Today I would like to give my thoughts and a brief review of Philip Chase's book, The Way of Edan. I don't personally own a tweed jacket, but I wore the closest thing to it to match our Dear Dr. Fantasy. And this review's been a long time in coming. I got this book when it first came out, but read about half of it, and then due to some circumstances in my life, stopped reading and was able to complete the book recently thanks to the excellent audiobook read by Alan Walker, known here on YouTube as the Library of Alexandria. And we'll talk about that audiobook a little bit later on, but first, just to speak generally of what this book is about, The Way of Edan tells the story of a large, rather powerful nation with a strong, central, organized religion that's primarily run and manipulated by wizards that manufacture a holy war as an excuse to invade many of the surrounding nations around them. Meanwhile, while this is going on, a young farm boy, seemingly simple farm boy, named Dayraven, has what should have been a fatal encounter with an elf out in the woods. And rather than dying, this encounter seems to have awoken some mysterious, deep magic within him. And he's forced to leave his village, not just for his own safety, but also for the protection of the village itself. And he ends up getting swept up in this holy war as well. Now, if you can't tell, even just from that brief description, one thing a lot of people have pointed out is that this story takes a lot of classic fantasy ideas and plays with them. Philip Chase is very open about his influence from authors like J.R.R. Tolkien, Ursula Le Guin, and even older influences such as Beowulf and older Anglo-Saxon tales. And you can definitely see that influence here. Although I would say, as far as the story goes, I don't necessarily see a ton of story influence from Tolkien as far as the beats of the plot of The Way of Edan goes. More of Tolkien's influence comes into this book in the way that the story is told. Just like Tolkien, Philip Chase takes plenty of time to explore this world, let you know about the people groups, and actually make you care about the different villages and cultures that he's built out in this trilogy. He also takes time to expand the world through songs and poems that characters recite and encounter. This all lends to a feeling of verisimilitude, but also makes the world feel much bigger than just this one individual story that's being told. So the Tolkien influence on this book, as far as I could tell, came much more in how the story was being conveyed, both in that style and also the way that Chase writes. Chase's writing style, his prose, is very beautiful. It's very readable, but there's a sense of sophistication with how he writes. You can tell he's put a lot of thought, not just down to how the story is going to go, but even in deliberate word choices in various passages and in juxtaposing certain scenes with each other to convey specific points. His writing has a very classical feeling to it, but also a sharp, modern edge to it. There will be passages with beautiful flowing prose, and then other parts of the book where there are moments that are shocking or violent enough that even George Martin would get a little bit squeamish reading some of this. And I don't know Dr. Chase personally. I've commented on some of his videos, but that's about it. But he comes across, at least on YouTube, as being a very nice, pleasant fellow, and to be honest, I was a little shocked and surprised at how dark he was willing to get in this story. And the people who dismiss this book as simply being, reworking classic fantasy tropes, I think are really selling it short. I think a lot of those trappings are there because Chase wants you thinking about those classic traditional stories in this genre with the modern spin that he's putting on it, and with many of the modern messages that he's trying to communicate here. Because even though many of the trappings seem classic, in a sense, the heart of this story and what's being communicated is something that I found quite unique, at least this style of fantasy. The last thing I'll say about Philip Chase's writing is that I found it to be very evocative. I don't tend to be a particularly visual reader. There are very few authors where when I'm reading I can picture it perfectly in my mind. Gene Wolfe and Patrick Rothfuss are some of the only authors who I just find their writing very vivid and visual. But to be perfectly frank, Philip Chase is now another one of them. When I think of The Way of Edan, it's not just, a general storyline or a couple of specific moments. Philip Chase writes in very vivid and striking scenes that help differentiate the different parts of the plot. So whether it's a dwarven funeral or whether it's an escape from the local village guards, these scenes stand out in my mind and are very distinct from one another. It's not that each scene goes with each chapter, but I have a very clear memory of the distinct different events and incidents that our characters have in this story, which is abnormal, at least in my experience, with a lot of modern fantasy books where maybe it isn't as vivid to me. Now, I don't really know how a lot of people would define philosophical fantasy, and to some people that might even be a byword, that might be a negative thing. But to me, more so than the interesting characters and the interesting world building and the interesting magic, all of which Philip Chase has in this book, the questions that he's exploring in this book really are what propelled me through it. Really, that's what I found to be the most interesting. It's a book about a holy war, so religion is going to be one of the big topics here. But the fantasy genre, if you're familiar with it at all, has a very complicated relationship with religion. Some of the most well-known early founding fathers of the genre, at least the famous ones, were very religious people, such as Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and even going back farther, George MacDonald. And yet, as it progressed for them, it became a lot more secularized, and there's many fantasy authors since then who've been very hostile to religion. Philip Pullman is probably one of the most famous examples of this, but there are many, many others. And so it's easy to go into a book like this when there's an organized religious structure that serves as one of the main antagonists to the stories and just be like, okay, another evil Catholic Church stand-in to this story. But I think if you pay close attention to what Philip Chase is doing, I don't know what his personal beliefs are when it comes to organized religion, Catholicism, medieval Catholicism, and he may very well be critical of all of those things. But it becomes pretty clear in this book that this is not a direct one-for-one allegory, and that's something that I appreciated. At first, when we're reading about these high priests and this domineering monotheistic religion, I wondered what he was doing here, but as you learn more about these priests, who are, in my opinion, the most interesting characters and the most fascinating parts of this book were about this antagonistic religion, the more you learn about them, the more you realize this is not one unified coalition that's promoting this philosophy and this religion. There's a lot of inner political scheming going on. Some people are true believers, are truly, sincerely trying to follow their religion to the best of their abilities, and other people are pretty callous about it. They're very manipulative. They're just using this because it's the powerful force in the world, and so they've worked their way up the ladder, as it were, and this is how they've chosen to place themselves in a position of power. And there are also other people, even in leadership, who deal with doubts and wonder if the way that the religion is being expressed or the way it's being implemented, if that is truly in line with the original teachings of this religion. Philip Chase brings a much more nuanced take to the bad fantasy religion trope, as some people would see it, than a lot of other examples that I've seen in the fantasy genre. And I really appreciated that. To be honest, I'm really interested to see where that's going to go in the second and third book. Because even though this first book can seem very classical to many people, it's clear that this setup is going to lead to a different conclusion than what you might initially be led to expect. And you can even get that just from the way that he writes. Even though this story shares many genes with classical fantasy stories, the genes might be similar, but the final conclusions are very different. One other point that I'd like to address with the ideas that are presented here is you would expect, in a lot of these types of stories, it's like, big evil empire with powerful religion, and then the good, noble farm people with the plucky rebellion, fighting against them. And as we've talked about, Chase is playing with your expectations here, because not just are there priests and members of the religious class that doubt their faith and are questioning the morality of what they're doing, but the village class and many of the people from the farm boy Dayraven's village that we're presented with, there's a lot of moral ambiguity there as well. Dayraven, who is our protagonist, owns a slave in this book, which is going to be a very challenging thing for many 21st century readers. You look at that and it's like, you might expect that with classical fantasy tropes, and yet that's a moral wrong that our protagonist is complicit in and benefiting from, at least to some extent. Now, Dayraven is clearly a much more moral slave or servant owner than most other characters in this book, but it's still a moral evil that he's participating in. And even though he plans on doing well by his servant, doing well by that person, it's still an evil system that he's complicit in. And so I found it interesting that Chase did not have any turning to the camera moments, as some authors might be tempted to say, look at this is bad. He trusts the reader to understand that even though these are, at least in their minds, good people trying to do the right thing, they themselves have severe moral failings and places where they're very much in the wrong. And one of the last things that I'd like to bring up, just something that I really appreciated about this book, is the way Philip Chase writes magic. I know there's a lot that's said about magic system and hard magic, people can complain about that, and that's fine. I'm pretty sympathetic to a lot of those views, but even still, there's a lot of magic in fantasy books that reads a lot more like fantasy science or fantasy superpowers than the actual occult, the secret, the mysterious, the uncanny. And the way Philip Chase writes magic in this first Edan book, I found to be quite compelling, quite mysterious, even scary at times. It's an uncontrollable thing. Often the use of old forgotten languages or of song is used to try to control magic or to try to use it in some way. And to me, that once again lended this feeling of it being like an ancient medieval type story, similar to Beowulf or one of these older Anglo-Saxon tales. It lent itself to feeling more akin to that than just, fantasy science or fantasy powers. If I were to talk briefly about things that some people might find negative in this book, I'll say there's a lot of things in this book that other people have listed as negative that personally, I really enjoyed. I didn't have a problem with. So this is more me speaking from a place of personal preference. A lot of people have said this book feels slow. It feels like a starting book, or at least I've heard people mention that. To me, all of the pacing in this book seemed very, very deliberate on Philip Chase's part. It seemed like he was intentionally setting up things. If he wants the time in the book to feel slow, if he wants you to feel like not much progress is being made, that's intentional. It's to help communicate where the characters are at, or to make you stop and focus and pay attention to something that's going on. So for me, the pacing of this book was excellent. I really enjoyed it. The one exception I would give to that is there were a few moments that did actually feel a bit short to me, that I felt like could have spent a little bit more time on a couple of scenes. But really, that's the one minor quibble there. The plot does take a little bit of time to reveal itself. It's not that nothing happens or that it's slow or there's no plot till about halfway through the book, but a lot of separate things happen. And it takes a while, at least it did for me as a reader, to piece them together and figure out where it was all going. Personally, I love this book. I found it incredibly engaging, and now I'm stuck with a bit of a conundrum, and that is, I finished this book, like I said, mostly on audio, and I really want to get into book 2, but the audiobook for book 2 is still in production now, so do I wait for that, or do I pick it up immediately? I'd like to share just a few thoughts on the audiobook. I would say that really is the preferred way to go through this book. I know some people have a question about some books are better on audiobook, some books are really difficult to understand on audio. I found The Way of Edan to be excellent on audio, very understandable, and Alan Walker, the reader here, is second to none. I listen to a lot of fantasy audiobooks, and there are many people who are considered the greats, whether it's Stephen Pacey, Simon Vance, James Marsden, and I think Alan Walker is up there. I know he's not doing audiobooks full time, but I think he very well could. His narration for this was some of the most enjoyable to listen to and smooth narration I've heard in any fantasy audiobook. To be honest, I felt like his narration was better than some professional audiobook narrators that I've listened to. And when it starts, it's entertaining to be like, oh, hey, that's Alan reading this. But really, it took about 5 or 10 minutes before I completely forgot and just was swept away with his dramatic reading of the story. His voices for different characters are absolutely amazing. Even for small, minor characters, you can tell that there's a lot of personality put behind the voice. So absolutely worth the money to get the audiobook for this, guys. I would recommend that over reading it physically, or if you want to do both, that's fine. But this audiobook really should not be missed, so absolutely check it out. So that's really the question moving forward, is wait for the next audiobook, which I probably will. I had such a fun time listening to this book. And the last point that I'll say briefly is I'm sure if Philip Chase and I were to have an hour-long conversation about religion, we would probably see things slightly differently. But that does not really in any way affect my review of this book, and that is because this was a very well-written book. Philip Chase made his points very, very well, his writing was excellent, and many of the concerns and questions that he brought up are excellent questions to be asked. And even if I have different answers that I've personally come to than he did, I still think it was very, very well put forward. So this book is absolutely worth your time. If you haven't checked it out, be sure to check out the audiobook. I listened to it on Audible. I'm sure you can find it there or other places where audiobooks are sold. But guys, definitely check out The Way of Edan by Philip Chase if you haven't. This book flies in the face of all myths about self-published fantasy. It is very well written, well plotted, and I can't wait to read the next books in this series. Anyway, guys, that's it for today. Have a good one.